Ready? Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna do our pre-trip Form A. Form A is starting from the front of the truck and checking the engine compartment. First thing we want to do is check the overall condition of our vehicle, making sure it's not leaning to the left or to the right, which could indicate a tire or suspension problem. Next, we're going to check our clearance lights, our marker lights, and our headlights, our left turn signal, our right turn signal, and our four-way flashers, making sure that they are all properly mounted and secured. They're not damaged, clean, not cracked, and proper color. Amber to the front, red to the rear. Lastly, we're going to check underneath to make sure that there aren't any fresh puddles, which could indicate an oil leak or a coolant leak. Just check for fresh puddles, which could indicate a leak. Okay, next thing we're going to do is open up our hood. Undo our hood latches. Open the hood. Always starting on the driver's side. Okay, so we're gonna come over here, start on the driver's side. Ooh. Okay, first thing we're gonna start with is our engine oil. The oil dipstick, we wanna check the level, okay? For the test, you guys don't have to pull it out, wipe it, but we're gonna explain how we would check it. So how I would check the oil level is I would pull out the dipstick, I would wipe it clean, reinsert it, pull it back out, and make sure it's at proper operating level, which is above low and below full. Okay, next we're going to come over here and move to our power steering reservoir, making sure it's properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged. There's fluid inside, so we want to make sure it's not leaking, and also at proper operating level, which is above low and below full. Then we're going to move on to our power steering hoses and fittings. Hoses, fittings, make sure that they are all properly mounted and secured, no cuts, cracks, or frays. There's fluid inside, so we want to make sure it's not leaking. We're going to follow this power steering hose back here to our power steering pump. Our power steering pump is properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, there's also fluid inside, it's not leaking, and it's also gear driven. Attached to our power steering pump is our air compressor. Can't really see it, but it is back here if you go ahead and dive down there. So our air compressor is properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, there's air in there, it's not leaking, and it's also gear driven. Okay, after we check our air compressor, we want to come back here, check our air compressor hoses. All our hoses and fittings that go to our air tanks. Okay, we want to make sure that it's properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, it's not leaking. Then we're going to come back up here, and next we're going to check our steering components. Okay, so our steering components, we got our steer shaft, our gearbox, our pitman arm, our drop or drag link. You have your steering knuckle in here, steering knuckle, you have your kingpin, you have your tie rod running across, and our tie rod ends, and our castle nuts and cotter pins. We want to make sure that they are all properly mounted, secured, they're not damaged, not missing any hardware, and we want to make sure that our gearbox is not leaking. Okay, next we're going to check our suspension components, starting with our leaf spring hangers or mounts. Our front and rear leaf spring hangers are both properly mounted, secured, they're not damaged, not missing any hardware. Next we're going to check our leaf springs, properly mounted, secured, not damaged, not missing any hardware. None are missing or misaligned. So a misaligned leaf spring, they're usually scissored if they're misaligned. We want to make sure that that's not the case. Next, we're going to check our shock and our shock mount. Okay, shock and shock mount, they're both properly mounted and secured, not damaged. Our shock is not leaking, and our mounts aren't missing any hardware. Then we'll move on to our U-bolts. Our U-bolts are properly mounted, secured, they're not damaged, not missing any hardware. After that, we'll move on to our air brake components, starting with our air brake hose and fittings. It's properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, not leaking. Our air brake chamber is properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, it's not leaking. Next, we'll move on to our push rod and slack adjuster. Okay, it's properly mounted, secured, not damaged, not missing any hardware. To check for proper adjustment, we would chalk the wheels, release the parking brake, and we would pull on the slack adjuster and make sure that there is no more than 1 inch of play. If there was more than 1 inch of play, it's out of adjustment. Okay, next we're gonna move on to our brake lining, okay, or your brake pads or shoes, but our brake lining, okay, it's properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, it's not worn less than 1/4 of an inch or dangerously thin. Next we have our brake drum. Brake drum is properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, and there is no foreign material such as oil or grease inside the drum. Okay, next we're gonna check our rim. So we'll start with the inner and outer of the rim. It's properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, there are no cracks or illegal welds on our rim. Next we'll check the overall condition of our tire. Properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, and it's not leaking. Next we're checking the inner and outer sidewalls, that there are no cuts, cracks, or bubbles. We're also checking for even tread wear and proper tread depth, which is minimum 430 seconds on the steer tire and a minimum of 230 seconds on the drive tires. Next, we're gonna check our lug nuts. Ooh, those are on tight. Next, we're gonna check our lug nuts. Okay, so what we're looking for are the lug nuts, making sure they're properly mounted, secured, they're not damaged, none are missing or loose. Indication of a loose lug nut would be rust trails and shiny threads. After we check our lug nuts, we're gonna look for our valve stem. Boom, valve stem. It's properly mounted and secured, it's not damaged, and it's not leaking. How we would check for proper tire pressure is with a tire pressure gauge. Okay, lastly, we're gonna check our hubcap oiler. It's properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, and it's not leaking. And it's also at the proper operating level, which is above low and below full. So that's everything on the driver's side. Now we can go ahead and check the parts that are unique on the passenger side. Okay, so here on the passenger side, we're gonna go ahead and start with our coolant reservoir, making sure it's properly mounted and secured, it's not damaged, it's not leaking, and it's also at proper operating level, above low, below full. Since we're here, we can go ahead and check our coolant hoses and fittings. Coolant hoses, fittings, okay, they're properly mounted, secured, not damaged, not leaking. Next, we're gonna check our alternator. We have our alternator. It's properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, not missing any hardware, and it's belt driven. Okay, so, and then next we're gonna check our alternator wires and connectors. It's properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, no cuts, cracks, or frays. Since our alternator is belt driven, we wanna go ahead and check our serpentine belt. Our serpentine belt is properly mounted and secured, it's not damaged, no cuts, cracks, or frays, and there is no more than 3/4 of an inch of deflection. So deflection is push, play is pull. So when you're checking for deflection and you're telling the examiner you're checking for deflection, don't pull. You want to push, okay? Next, we're gonna check our water pump. Our water pump is properly mounted and secured, it's not damaged, it's not leaking, and it's also belt driven. So we're gonna go ahead and check our serpentine belt again. Our serpentine belt is properly mounted and secured. It's not damaged. There's no cuts, cracks, or frays, and there's no more than 3/4 of an inch of deflection. And this completes my pre-trip Form A.